What would you do if the most powerful man in the world looked at your uniform and laughed? If a salute meant to honor protocol, meant to acknowledge something sacred, was brushed off like a tourist gag? That's exactly what happened on a quiet runway at Heathrow Airport. When former US President George W. Bush landed for a diplomatic visit and was greeted by a single royal guard standing perfectly still. Bush chuckled. The Americans with him joked. Even a few British officials smiled politely. But what none of them knew, not yet, was who was behind that red coat, or what that man had once done, when the bullets were real and the silence meant life or death. Because by the time someone whispered his name, the laughter stopped cold. Now, before we reveal the full story, first hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The moment George W. Bush laughed, it didn't seem like much. A private jet had just rolled to a stop on the Heathrow tarmac, wheels hissing, engines winding down in the mid-morning haze. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and summer dew, and a small diplomatic welcome party stood by in formation. Not flashy, just appropriate. British embassy officials, a handful of military personnel, a few senior aides, and standing slightly off to the side, posted like an exclamation point beside the red carpet, was a single royal guard. He didn't move when the hatch opened, didn't blink when the stairs lowered with a mechanical sigh, just stood there, perfectly still, perfectly square, the white of his gloves sharp against the crimson of his tunic. The former US president emerged with that familiar bounce in his step, waving casually before descending. He shook hands briskly with each official down the line, offering a joke here, a nod there, that practiced Texan warmth never far behind. But when he reached the last man, taller than most, older than expected, silent as a statue, Bush slowed. The guard snapped a salute, crisp, not ceremonial, military, and Bush, caught slightly off guard, chuckled. Just a little. A quick puff of breath through his nose, head cocked as if to say, "Well, all right then." One of the Secret Service agents standing behind him smirked. Another muttered under his breath, pretty intense for a mannequin. Bush turned to one of his aides and said something low, something amused. The guard didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't respond in any visible way at all, and that might have been the end of it. A brief, forgettable moment in a long day of diplomatic meet and greets. Another photo op with a man in a red coat, until someone leaned in and whispered a name. Just a name. 7 letters, but enough to stop a former president mid-sentence. George W. Bush's smile faltered. His eyes snapped back to the guard. "You sure?" he asked the aide quietly. The aide nodded, his face pale. "Just confirmed." Bush looked again, really looked, and then, in a voice low enough that only the men nearest him could hear, he said, "Holy hell, that's who that is!" 5 hours earlier, the back corridors of Heathrow's VIP arrival terminal were quiet in that particular way only government facilities get, orderly, hushed, and faintly fluorescent. The morning briefing was short and forgettable. A few line items on perimeter duty, radio protocols and assignment slips, all rattled off in the monotone rhythm of a man who knew no one was truly listening. But one line stood out. Warrant Officer Calder, tarmac detail, hangar 3B, full dress, eyes forward, you'll be representing Household Division today. There was a flicker of pause in the room. Not because of the assignment itself, but because of the name, Calder. Among the younger guardsmen, that name didn't carry much weight. Most had only ever seen him in passing. An older man, late 50s perhaps, built like a broad-shouldered shadow, with silver at his temples and a stare that seemed to pass through walls. He didn't speak much, didn't linger in the mess hall or trade banter in the locker rooms. He wasn't rude exactly, just out of phase, like someone who had memorized an entirely different version of the playbook they were all working from. "Didn't even know he still took live postings," one guardsman muttered as they buttoned up their tunics. He doesn't, another replied, a little lower. Last time he suited up was, the Queen's Jubilee? Before that, nobody knows. Why Heathrow? Why now? Sergeant Mallory, broad-chested, mid-40s, always chewing invisible gum, overheard the murmuring and cut it off with a glance. If Calder asked for tarmac 3B, then Calder gets tarmac 3B, he said. That's not up for discussion. Someone else dared to ask, but why would he request it? It's barely ceremonial. Mallory just looked at him. Maybe he didn't come for the ceremony. Later that hour, as the rotation of guards began suiting up in their dressing rooms, Calder stepped out of the shadows near the far end of the hallway, already fully dressed. He moved with the ease of someone who'd done this too many times to count, and yet with a gravity that made everyone instinctively shift out of his way. Even in a room full of scarlet and brass, he stood out. His tunic wasn't newer or shinier. His bearskin cap was regulation. But the weight of his silence, of his composure, made him look carved out of something older than tradition. "Warrant Calder," Mallory greeted him with a nod. "All set?" Calder adjusted one white glove with mechanical precision. "Yes, Sergeant." "No special requests? You're going to be out there a while." "I'll manage." "You sure you want 3B?" Calder looked at him, not sharply, just steadily. "I requested it." Mallory didn't press. "All right, then." As the others moved out, Calder stood for a moment alone at the back of the dressing room. He opened a small locker and removed a weathered cloth from the top shelf. Inside it, wrapped like something sacred, was a steel service medal, dull with age, its ribbon tucked carefully behind. He didn't pin it, just held it for a moment, then returned it to its place. Then he stepped out into the morning sun, his posture settling into that timeless form, spine straight, chin set, eyes forward, and walked to the tarmac without a word. He never once asked who was arriving, and no one dared to ask why. By the time the diplomatic arrival convoy was in motion, the heat had begun to rise off the tarmac in waves. Hangar 3B was tucked away from the chaos of Heathrow's main terminals, a side corridor for private landings, state visits, and discreet political manoeuvring. It wasn't glamorous, but it was heavily controlled, which made it ideal for the arrival of someone like George W. Bush. The detail was light. 3 embassy liaisons, a pair of MOD attachés, 5 security personnel, and a royal guard posted in full dress near the welcome line. Mostly symbolic, mostly for optics, but as the team from the American embassy milled about, inspecting clipboards and radios, their casual demeanour began to crack against the sheer stillness of the man standing at the edge of the runway. Warrant Officer Calder hadn't shifted once. Not even a blink. His gloves hung perfectly at his sides. The sun hammered the black bearskin cap, but if it was too hot, he gave no sign. "Jeez," one of the American agents muttered, adjusting his sunglasses. "How long's he been like that?" "Since before we got here," replied another, sipping from a bottle of mineral water. "Is he allowed to, breathe?" A third chuckled. "He looks like one of those guys from a wax museum." "Do they all come that serious?" One of the younger British aides, standing nearby in a pressed grey suit, smirked. "That's the Coldstream lot. Don't blink, don't twitch, don't smile. If their bootlaces aren't aligned with God's own spine, they probably get flogged." The Americans laughed, lightly at first. Then came the small bets. "I'll give 20 if he moves before touchdown. Make it 50 if he even scratches his nose." A few chuckled again. One of them even lifted his phone, angling it toward Calder. The screen shook slightly. The man couldn't hold the camera steady, because the longer you looked at Calder, the less funny it felt. It wasn't just the stillness. Plenty of ceremonial guards stood straight. But there was something in the air around him, something coiled, like the weight of his posture was less about discipline and more about restraint. "He's older, right?" one of the agents asked suddenly. "Yup, way older than the rest. That normal?" The embassy attaché, a career civil servant named Elliot Barrington, overheard and cleared his throat. "Some men come back to ceremonial postings late in their career," he said. "It's rare, but not unheard of." "Come back?" one agent asked. Barrington didn't elaborate, just nodded toward the runway. "Incoming." The private jet descended with graceful slowness, wheels touching the tarmac like a whisper. It coasted toward the reception line under escort, the engines winding down as the stairs were wheeled into place. And then, from the open hatch, descended George W. Bush. He looked older than most remembered, but still unmistakable. Broad smile, easy charm, suit jacket unbuttoned like it was a Texas barbecue instead of a UK state visit. He moved quickly down the stairs, waving casually, handshaking as he reached the ground. When he reached the guard, he slowed. Just a second. Calder lifted his arm in a formal salute. Precise. Clean. Sharp enough to cut through the warm air. Bush raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Well now," he said with a chuckle, "they really roll out the statues for us." A few people laughed. Tight, polite laughter, the kind that's half reflex and half awkwardness. One of the security agents leaned toward Bush and said, "Should we see if he's got a coin slot on the back?" Bush grinned, then looked back at Calder. "Bet he's never seen combat, huh?" That's when someone quietly, firmly stepped forward. Elliot Barrington, the attaché. He had a tablet in one hand and a slight tremor in the other as he cleared his throat and leaned toward a U.S. liaison officer. "Tell him not to joke," Barrington murmured. "Not about this one." "Why?" the aide asked, frowning. Barrington didn't answer. He just turned the tablet screen around and showed the man a page, a profile and a name, and one black and white photo, grainy, dust-choked, half obscured by the smoke of a battlefield. The aide read the file, his face drained of colour, and without waiting for permission, he walked straight toward the former President of the United States. Bush had already moved on to shake hands with a few British officials, still carrying that boyish grin, until his aide whispered something in his ear. Bush blinked, then frowned. "What did you say?" The aide repeated it, quieter this time. Just a name. Just one. Bush's expression changed. It was subtle, but immediate. The smile faltered. The lines around his eyes hardened. He turned to look back, at the still figure standing alone beside the aircraft. And this time, he didn't laugh. The shift in George W. Bush's expression was so sudden, so total, that even the agents behind him fell quiet. For a man who had once faced down foreign parliaments and global press pools, whose public image was built on unshakable ease, even in awkward moments, the look on his face now wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition, and something very close to regret. He turned away from the handshake line and took a slow step back toward the guard. The aides exchanged glances, none of them moved. Calder hadn't shifted since the salute. His boots remained locked on the tarmac. His chin was level. His eyes didn't follow the former president, but everyone else did. Bush stopped just shy of the rope barrier, studying the man in red. It was strange, watching someone who had led the free world stare at a silent soldier like he was the one searching for clearance. "How long's he been back?" Bush murmured, not taking his eyes off Calder. The aide beside him hesitated. 6 months, quiet reinstatement, no press, internal clearance only. And they put him out here, in uniform. "He asked for it, sir." Bush nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. His tone was softer now, more weighted. "They told me he was gone. They told everyone that." At that, Bush exhaled, a long, weary breath. He glanced again at Calder's posture, the way he held himself not with pride, but with obligation. Like stillness wasn't just discipline. It was atonement. "You have his file on you?" Bush asked. The aide nodded, already retrieving it on his device. A few seconds later, the screen was glowing between them. A blurred photo, dusty, unsmiling. A younger Calder, eyes locked on the camera like it had interrupted something more important. Below the image, a name stamped in military typeface. Warrant Officer Calder, former SAS liaison, retired, presumed MIA, 2007, Helmand Province. Call sign, Whisper read. Bush read in silence the recommended for distinguished service order, suspended pending tribunal. Final mission, Musa Kala perimeter defense. Evac site compromised. 8 confirmed survivors due to sustained defense by Officer Calder. Injury status classified. Operational decisions disputed. Media blackout enforced by MOD. There was a moment when even the breeze seemed to stop moving. The aide spoke low. He refused medevac, sir. Stayed behind. Shielded the site until the second wave came in. I know what he did, Bush said quietly. We had eyes on the sat feed. My staff wanted to escalate. MOD shut it down. Why? Because sometimes it's easier to bury a miracle than explain it. Bush looked up again. There was something ancient in Calder's stillness, something you couldn't fake. He took a careful step forward, eyes narrowing. That man covered for a mistake that wasn't his. Took a hit that should have ended his career, then disappeared while everyone else spun the story. The aide didn't respond. Bush's jaw flexed, and now he's back, standing in a red coat while we all pretend nothing happened. He took one more step closer, enough to be heard, if not seen clearly. And he said, just loud enough for the guard to catch, I thought we lost you. Calder gave no sign that he'd heard. But for the first time, the silence between them wasn't just professional, it was personal. Bush straightened his cuffs, composed his voice, and turned slightly toward the line of embassy staff watching him. He didn't smile, he didn't joke him, he simply said, get me the officer in charge. Now. Across the tarmac, Elliot Barrington had already begun moving. Expression unreadable, tablet tucked under one arm. As he passed one of the younger attachés, he whispered something under his breath. The young man blinked. Wait, he's whisper-read. Barrington nodded. And you'd do well not to repeat it outside this runway. A moment on, the joking stopped. The chatter faded. The snide comments about costumes and stillness and pageantry were replaced by something else entirely. Silence, reverence, and something that almost resembled shame. Because every person on that tarmac now knew the same thing. They weren't standing beside a guard, they were standing beside a ghost. One who had come back, not to be seen, but to be remembered. The sun had just begun to burn away the mist that clung to Helmand Province when the perimeter broke. It was December 2007, a forgotten ridge just outside Musa Kala, barely marked on the official maps, known only as Checkpoint Grey Hawk to the men who'd been forced to dig in with nothing but bad intel and worse odds. Captain Calder had been awake for nearly 42 hours by then, running on adrenaline, sand-scoured rations, and pure stubborn instinct. The evacuation point was already compromised. A Black Hawk had gone down on approach, taking with it 2 medics and the unit's only secure satellite relay. They had wounded, they had smoke, they had no comms, no backup, and no time. When the second wave hit the south embankment, Taliban fighters armed with RPGs and modified mortars. It wasn't strategy that kept the survivors alive, it was Calder. He moved like someone whose body had already accepted death and simply hadn't told the rest of him. His shoulder was dislocated, his trigger finger broken. He refused morphine. At one point, he carried a bleeding radio tech on his back across an open stretch of earth that had already claimed 2 soldiers. The tech survived. Calder came back with 3 new shrapnel wounds and no expression at all. Later, when the western slope began to buckle under indirect fire, the order came through, partial evac only. Calder was told to board with the first wave. He refused. "This line doesn't break," he said to the RAF pilot. "Not while they're still breathing." He held the outer wall for nearly 2 hours with only one other man, Private Langston, barely 19, half conscious and bleeding from the leg. When Langston later gave a statement, he described Calder's actions in one line. He made death look like it was the one on borrowed time. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. The hill was held. 8 soldiers lived who would not have. And then Calder disappeared. Officially, he was listed as WIA, retired. The citation for the Distinguished Service Order was quietly suspended. An inquiry was opened and then quietly closed. No medals were issued, no press releases given. The reports from that ridge went under lock and key in a MODI archive labelled Greyhawk Incident Internal Only. Some said it was political, others said it was punishment, but most just forgot. Until 6 months ago. When a request came through to London HQ, an old regimental number reactivated with quiet approval. No ceremony, no questions, just a uniform order and one line of instruction. If possible, place near foreign diplomatic activity, clearance level Alpha 4. He was back, not to correct the record, not to make a statement, just to stand. The red carpet hadn't even been fully rolled when Bush turned back. His pace wasn't hurried, but it was deliberate, calculated, like a man walking towards something he'd hoped never to see again, and yet couldn't bring himself to ignore. Security detail instinctively flanked him, but he waved them off with a quiet shake of the head. Warrant Officer Calder remained exactly where he'd been posted, unmoving, arms down, eyes fixed on the middle distance. Bush stepped within a few feet, not close enough to breach protocol, just enough to be heard. There was a long silence. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, Bush raised his right hand and returned the salute. It wasn't casual. It wasn't performative. It was military. Calder didn't move, not at first, but then, with the smallest adjustment, so precise it looked like it had been practiced for years, he lowered his salute in response. That was the only signal exchanged. But for the few officials watching closely, the air felt heavier, charged. Bush leaned slightly forward, his voice low, but not so soft that Calder wouldn't hear. I read what happened at Musa Kala. We saw the footage. Some of it, anyway. No reaction from the guard. My staff said it was a mess. Politics got in the way. I didn't push hard enough. Still, Calder gave no sign of acknowledgement. They said you stayed because you didn't trust the evac plan. Said you saved lives we weren't supposed to save. The sun beat down on both men now, unrelenting, as another plane taxied in the distance. Nobody else spoke, nobody dared interrupt. Bush straightened. His face had lost its usual brightness. What replaced it was the kind of solemnity reserved for soldiers and graves. I'm sorry we didn't do better by you. For the first time all morning, Calder moved. Barely. A single blink. His jaw tightened, then stilled. Bush gave a final nod. Hell of a thing! Standing still after all that. Most men would have disappeared for good. He turned without waiting for a reply. As he rejoined his group, one of the younger diplomats stepped toward him with a tentative tone. Sir, are we... Bush cut him off gently. Let's move. The formalities resumed. The handshakes, the smiles, the photo ops. But something had shifted. Nobody joked about the red coat now. Nobody called it theatre. From the far end of the tarmac, Calder stood like a remnant from a time the world had tried to bury. A reminder not of performance but of persistence. The kind of man who never needed to raise his voice because his silence already said more than most would ever dare. When the motorcade finally pulled away, black cars gleaming under the high noon sun, sirens off, just the low hum of rubber on tarmac, nobody clapped. There was no applause, no back-patting among staff, no casual return to chatter. The energy had shifted. The same American security officer who'd earlier joked about coin slots now stood beside a colleague, arms folded tight across his chest. Who was that guy? He asked quietly. His colleague didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't simple. And because a few yards away, Calder was still standing in that same impossibly perfect position, unmoved, untouched, like time had tried and failed to reach him. Back at the perimeter edge, 2 young royal guards waited to rotate in for their next watch. They watched Calder like students watching a man do something they'd been told was theoretically possible, but never actually seen. One of them leaned toward the other. "He saluted back," he said. "The president, he saluted him back." The second guard nodded. "I saw." The first shook his head. "I've never seen anyone do that. Not to one of us. Not like that." That's when Sergeant Mallory approached. "Back straight, lads. You're not tourists." They stiffened instinctively. "Yes, Sergeant." Mallory turned his gaze toward Calder, his voice lowered. "He's earned salutes from more than presidents." One of the guards swallowed. "That man? Is he really Whisper Red?" Mallory's jaw shifted, but he didn't confirm it. Not directly. He just said, "Some names aren't spoken. They're carried." As the sergeant turned away, Calder finally moved. Not much. Just one careful adjustment, rolling his shoulders back into square, realigning his feet, tightening the angle of his stance. The kind of adjustment only someone with hundreds of ceremonial hours would notice. But to those watching closely, it felt like a full breath exhaled after years held in. The American attaché, still holding the same tablet that had quietly derailed an entire diplomatic joke, glanced once more toward Calder before turning to leave. He said nothing, but the silence he left behind was heavier than any explanation could have been. Later that afternoon, the tarmac returned to routine. Jet engines roared. Cargo vehicles moved. The echo of daily operations resumed. But something lingered in the space Calder had stood. Stillness, not emptiness. Stillness. The kind that doesn't demand attention but reshapes it. The next morning, the barracks were quiet when Warrant Officer Calder entered the locker bay. He moved like someone used to empty corridors and early hours, before the newer lads started their clatter of boots and banter. He hung his dress tunic on the same peg he'd used since returning to service 6 months earlier. White gloves folded precisely. Bear's kin cap boxed. Across the room, Sergeant Mallory appeared, his voice low and casual. "You've got one more watch left, changing the guard tomorrow." Calder nodded. "I'll be there." Mallory stepped closer, hesitated. "You didn't have to come back, you know. Nobody expected you to." "I wasn't finished," Calder replied. "You are now." There was a pause. Mallory glanced down, then reached into his pocket and handed over a small envelope. "This came through late last night. MOD internal dot." Calder opened it slowly, eyes scanning the contents. One line. "DSO citation reinstated. Honours list forthcoming. Name to remain confidential as per prior request." He said nothing, but for the first time in hours, his jaw slackened just slightly, like something inside him had finally unclenched. When Calder walked through the barracks courtyard that afternoon, he passed 3 guards from the newer intake. They didn't speak, but all of them straightened reflexively. One of them, same boy who'd rotated in just after Bush's departure, stepped forward when he thought no one was watching. "Sir?" Calder stopped. The young man stood at attention, nervous. "I just wanted to say thank you for yesterday." Calder studied him for a long moment. Then he asked quietly, "You know why we stand still?" The recruit blinked. "Discipline, sir?" Calder shook his head. "So, people have time to think about what they're looking at." He stepped off again, his stride unhurried. The next morning at the gates of St. James's Palace, Calder took up his final ceremonial post. The changeover was clean. Guards moved with precision, boots striking stone in rhythmic cadence. As the bells rang out the hour, Calder turned toward the forecourt, and there, Among the tourists and cameras and early commuters stood the same young guard from the day before. He wasn't part of the watch, just watching. When their eyes met, the boy did something not listed in the guard's formal protocol. He saluted. It wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. Calder, still as ever, returned it. Not a snap, not a show, just a silent exchange between two men who now understood something most of the world never would. Then Calder resumed his stance. Spine straight, eyes forward, one last time. Would you have laughed like the others? Or would you have recognized what that salute really meant? Have you ever met someone who turned out to have a past far deeper than you expected? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. If this story made you see the uniform differently, give it a like, hit that subscribe button, and tap the bell icon so you never miss one of our daily Royal Guard stories. And if you know someone who still thinks these guards are just tourist attractions, share this video with them. It might just change their mind. Our next story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.